So, a very warm welcome from us. We're delighted to have you here. We're delighted to have you in the session. Just let me introduce us. First of all, so we've got Pegs Bailey from the TSI Scotland network, talking about No One Left Behind in a moment. We've got Suzanne Wilson from the University of Central Lancashire. We've got Lois Scharf, also from UCLan and from Thempra, and myself from Thempra Social Pedagogy as well. We're we're learning facilitators in lots of different ways, and I think what unites us is very much that shared belief that uh, co-production is is a brilliant opportunity to kind of really transform how public service works and to make sure that people feel really included and meaningfully part of their local community and have an opportunity to kind of actively shape what's going on. So we are all part of the Human Learning Systems Collaborative as well. And we want to introduce you today to human learning systems and why it's such a powerful, such an appealing sort of orientation to changing the way that public service works for people and importantly with people. So the webinar today is very much guided by that. And we want to start off in a moment with a little case study, an HLS example of co-production practice, which Pex is going to introduce you, which is called No One Left Behind. We'll then give you a brief introduction into human learning system and then have an opportunity to explore in depth how the co-production principles connect with human learning systems. And we'll finish off with a conversation about what's the relevance of HLS for co-production practice. So I hope that sounds good. I hope that's kind of what you're here for. We're very interested in your perspectives, your questions. So please feel free to come in, contribute as much as you can. We want this to kind of really be co-created in terms of the learning space. We want it to be very relational. So we'll try and make sure that you have as many opportunities as we can arrange to come in and contribute and share your perspective and your expertise as well. So with that being said, I shall pass over to Pex.
Hi, everyone. So as Gabriel said, yeah, I'm Pegs. I currently work for the TSI network in Scotland, but the case study I'm going to talk about is actually work that I did while I was in Fife, working at Fife Voluntary Action, where Susan now is, and was around supporting their employment strategy. So if we go on to the next slide. So about 5 years ago, Scottish Government shifted how it was doing employability funding in Scotland to locally devolved spend that was supposed to be overseen by local employability partnerships. And in Fife, they really seized on that opportunity to try and think about how we could do things differently. These are the principles that sit behind the policy, but the ones that kind of were really relevant to how we driving the move towards kind of a co-production approach was were around the commitment to dignity and respect and continuous improvement, the drive to have support which is person-centered, and really critically down at the bottom there, a drive to have services which would and strategy which is driven by evidence, including data and the experience of users, so that this was something which was kind of grounded in how we approach the whole thing. I would say that there are a growing number of local authorities that are really embedding this in how they're approaching employability now. There's still a long way to go, and that's fantastic. That's all right. We're all on this journey together. I think the reason we were on the front foot in Fife is because we'd already done a bit of work around this in the context of mental health and employability services, and that meant that we were kind of a bit more ready to go. So if we go to the next slide, yes, Gabriel will talk a bit more about this afterwards, but what we see in the landscape of employability is very much this kind of treatment of employability as though it's kind of a complicated problem. If we input CV and interview skills to X person here, then they will become employable out there. But actually the reality of their experience and everybody's journey to work is much more unique, much more complex. And so if we were going to try and design an employability pathway in Scotland in Fife that was going to be relevant to people, then we wanted to do so in a way which really understood what that felt like from the perspective of people who are using services, not just ours. And this is my lovely little image of why I just think co-production just makes sense, because the world looks very different to all of us depending on where we sit. A bit like when we're looking on the pirate ship. So yeah, so we thought it was really important to make sure that we engaged a rounded load of perspectives in that design process, and that included the perspective of people who use services. So if we go on to the next slide. But it's not just about us making the services better in that kind of bigger picture. I think there's something else which is about the impact it has on the individuals that are involved in the co-production activity, involved in that service design journey. That process in and of itself is empowering if it's done well. It awakens agency for everybody who's involved, whether they're frontline staff who feel like things are done to them, or people who are using services and feel like they've become passive recipients of other people fixing their problems. So it actually is a powerful enabler of everything that we are trying to do. Next slide. So this is the bit that I think people are most interested in. It's like, what did we actually do? So so a couple of things that I kind of want to pick up on. Hang on, I'll just get my notes up in front of me. So in terms of the human, this is just very practically what did we do. So first of all, we had pretty much all the perspectives in the room from, I think it was the second meeting. We just needed a bit of a kind of like thumbs up from the powers that be, that they liked the idea of us taking a co-production approach. We did not call it human learning systems. I did not. I floated these phrases with some of our strategic partners. And to be honest, they were all a bit like, oh, that's just another model. You've only just got us used to co-production. So the human learning systems bit of this kind of ran underneath. It was like a foundation behind that kind of informed what I was doing and gave me confidence in terms of what I was doing. So we talked a lot about co-production. So all perspectives in the room from the start, very low tech, very just what we are doing, how we're going to approach this problem. We then also, the other human bit that we took was that we took an appreciative inquiry approach. So rather than focusing what was wrong, we tried to focus on what was working or people's positive experiences of support, whether that was with friends or with others when we engaged in the actual engagement process. We also asked people to focus on their personal experience. So quite often when you're getting involved in co-production work or any service planning design work, we often get people talking about what they need, what them, or why they are the problem, them. So we tried to kind of really anchor the conversations that we had in people's own experience of, for example, receiving support, or people's own experience of their journey to work. Whether they were a professional or somebody using services, we didn't have separate conversations for those two contexts. We also knew that there were some perspectives that we were really going to be missing unless we made a real big effort to reach them. So we worked very closely with Fife Centre for Equalities. We did targeted outreach to get to key voices, using trusted local partners, going to where they were. And we did quite a lot of equalities tracking to try and make sure that we could evidence the efforts that we'd made, and we could understand who we were missing. And obviously we didn't reach all communities. That would, we would have been miracle workers, but at least we knew who we hadn't reached and why. In terms of learning, I would say this was the least structured bit of like the human learning systems approach. But what we did practice was shared reflection during the research process. So there was a continual process of coming together, what worked, what didn't, what do we want to do next. There was very much a kind of continuous improvement attitude within the oversight team. And the kind of individual attitudes we were trying to bring, which was just kind of curiosity, rather than thinking that we knew the answers. Another thing that I put in the systems bit, which does come into the learning space, I think they all interact with each other, was we had collaborative conversations. So we tried as much as possible to bring the perspectives of people using services and people delivering services together. I would say we did less well with that than with other bits of co-production that I've done, just because it was online. It was in lockdown. But I think that foundational intention is quite important, because your learning shouldn't be happening just at the end of the journey. It needs to be happening all the time through the journey of whatever the co-production project might be. and then so kind of these were some of the systems that we put in place to try and support this whole process. So we did do detailed high level stakeholder analysis. Who do we need to be listening to? Who do we need to be talking to? Who are we missing? We made sure we had a multi-perspectival planning team, which I think is absolutely critical, and oversight team for the whole project. And that then has led into ongoing work in Fife. We had the collaborative conversation model, and then we did this online meetings, and we used a survey which could be completed on behalf of others. So we're trying to think about how the systems could be accessible. So next slide. I'm whistling through, I'm getting there. I'm not going to go through this in detail because this isn't an employability workshop, but I suppose the point is the outcome of that kind of from beginning to end 9-month process, but actually intense collaboration, probably 4-month process, was quite a significant change, which is still rolling out in terms of how employability services are delivered, how they're commissioned, and how they are governed and overseen in Fife. So a move from kind of we just get on with doing what we want to do, and you guys opt into the things, we tell you what's available, to something which is much more structured around individual need, much more complexity oriented in terms of people's journeys to work. Greater structures in terms of the voice of people using services in the service commissioning and oversight spaces, and a much more continuous improvement approach at all the levels of the system. So from service delivery right the way through. It is not perfect. It's absolutely not all there. It is a journey, but it's a journey that it feels like more and more is kind of considered the norm rather than us trying to shoe it in. Last slide, no, one more slide before this one. Some of the things we learned: it doesn't have to be called human learning systems to have a human learning systems attitude. So I think it's important to use the language which is going to work for your stakeholders, the ones that you need to buy into you doing this. However, it was very helpful to have that as a foundation. And for certain sectors like health, it's a real win. It's very important to get the right balance in the room. So this is the triangle which Christina, my colleague, developed, which shows what we feel needs to be happening, certainly in the oversight, and as much as possible in all the conversations. You need the perspective of the strategic decision makers, the professionals, and the people who you're trying to support as much as possible listening and learning together. Values matter more than structures, systems, and tools. And and from an HLS perspective, we could have thought more about that structured learning journey. Then the next slide. These are the top tips that are in our case study. Never be afraid to bring the service user perspective into your planning team as early as possible. That's a big message. Keep the core group small and focus on building the conditions with each other. Work with trusted partners. You're all co-production people, so this is probably very familiar. But do work with trusted partners if you need to reach certain perspectives. They are invaluable. Don't say we tried to invite them and they didn't come. Keep an eye on the budget timeline. This is critical. There's no point doing an amazing piece of learning work if you miss the deadline for when decisions are made on funding. So keep your eye on the actual practicalities of the system you're working within. Be practical and pragmatic about what you can achieve. Be prepared to fail and learn, and as much as possible bring people together, because then whatever else happens, there's insight in the room. So that's it from me. Thanks.
Is it me now? Yeah, thank you for that, Pegs. That was so interesting, and I've got so many notes. So I'm Suzanne Wilson, I'm a researcher, very applied researcher at University of Central Lancashire, and I've been doing co-production and participatory action research along the Cumbrian coast for the last 10 years. So I've just been invited to give some reflections on what Pegs has presented in her application of the human learning system. So I've been language totally, and to be driven by the people that you're working with. So like with my current research, I'm doing something about family wellbeing, and I thought it was a nice fluid kind of non-threatening term. Oh my God, it got ripped to pieces. It means absolutely naff all to the people I work with. Family, what does family mean? Family can be bad. Don't think family's good. People, after a large discussion, we decided to use the term people we choose to spend our time with. And well-being was just felt to mean nothing. So people decided that to make a difference in their lives, they wanted the conditions to be able to claim their voices, their choices, and their rights. which is totally different than what I was thinking of. So that's kind of reflecting on what you were saying about language and how important it is. And just by asking other people, it can just blow things out of the water. And it always makes it better in my experience. Like you come to people with a pre-made plan, but other folks can just, yeah, massively improve it. Thinking about the human aspect, another thing that in this family, because it is about families in whatever way, shape, or it is, we all have our own professional selves, so if we think about like the 3Ps with social pedagogy, we do have the personal, the professional, and the private. And within our group, we've agreed to bring some of the personal in. I cannot do a project about families and particularly young children, not being a professional, not acknowledging that I've got a 3.5-year-old who still doesn't sleep through the night, and and I have all my things. So it's about thinking about how much you bring to the table with that. As long as for me, it's like if there's a point of saying it, say it, but don't just say it to make it all about you. It's got to be purposeful when you cross over that line from professional to personal. But I think we need to value us all as human beings, and we bring a lot from that as well. And sometimes we, particularly in clinical work, I've got a psychology background, and it's very boundaries. You don't share anything about yourself. You keep that balance in the relationship. Well, actually, I think there's a shift from that now. In terms of learning, again, we all are experts, and I'm actually getting a bit of backlash up here with some of the Child Poverty Forum things about listening to people with lived experience too much and not valuing the views of professionals who've been working a lot in the area. So I don't think it's like a polarized thing. It's like just appreciating that everybody has something to bring to the table and it's all of equal value. And it doesn't matter if you've been doing something for 5 minutes or 50 years, it is equal, which can be a difficult space to manage sometimes, particularly with people who've been used to doing things a certain way. But that's the strength of that leadership and facilitation that Peg's talked about in her triangle. In terms of systems, so I'm working with the local councils and it's hard, there are so many different systems, and I use something called Brenner's social ecological model as like a loose framework to understand the different systems in which people and communities operate. So just think about all the different, messy systems, which Gabriel will be talking about in his next bit. I always use stakeholder analysis as well, Peg. I really recommend that when you're starting off on the journey. But then as you progress you talked about the collaborative conversations. In my recent experience trying to bring people with formal power, i.e. councillors and council members, with communities, I got my fingers burnt for not preparing the councillors. I spent lots of time preparing the community because I didn't want the community just going in there shouting at the councillors about the bins not being collected, yada, yada, yada. Well, actually, the councillors felt threatened, and they were the people who were hostile in that situation. I did have a briefing session with them, but I didn't consider the relational dynamics from that. So Peg's talked about the boat. I was looking from the island of the community, not perhaps from the boat that the council was set at. So try and think about all the different stakeholders you're working with, the different power. For me, I'm very much about power dynamics because I think that drives a lot of behaviour, particularly when behaviour isn't helpful. It's often because they're feeling their power is being threatened in some way. So if you try and think about that and prepare as much as you can for these collaborative conversations, that would be a recommendation from practice. Final point is we do talk about lived experience, and talking to a Scottish audience, I assume many of you have heard of Darren McGarvey, social commentator and rapper. I had the pleasure of hosting him here at Westlakes earlier this year. He's currently doing a piece of work on the industrialisation of lived experience. So how it's actually been almost not weaponized, but people are using it, and it is being used sometimes tokenistically, sometimes being used meaningfully, but the systems aren't always in place to protect people after people have allowed themselves to be vulnerable. So it's not just about, oh, we'll include you in the journey, we'll include your voice and we'll take your voice and now it's ours and we'll just leave you there feeling raw and vulnerable. It's about ensuring, and we don't have a set up framework for this. I think it's probably bespoke, but it will be about co-production and managing expectations as well. We all go into this work because we really give a damn, we really care, and we want to make a difference. And I have this in my previous project. I wanted to totally change the way the council did co-production and participatory democracy. It ain't happened yet. And now I feel like I've let the community down because all my energy and passion drove it, but that can only go so far. Um, and then the last thing is just be congruent as well. Just be totally honest about these things. I returned to the communities and said, I'm sorry, I was over enthusiastic. I've let you down. And we talked about that. And actually now, after a year, things are starting to change. So I guess that's another thing. When you're working with complex systems, it takes a blooming long time. Is that okay, guys? In terms of my
Yeah,
feedback?
thank you. Suzanne's just going to nip out and join another meeting, and then we'll join us again. So
Yeah.
we'll see you in a
Thank
minute.
you.
But we
Bye.
just wanted to offer you the chance as well to kind of reflect on what Pegs has said and think about what's kind of resonating for you with human learning systems. Gabriel's put a link to a Menti in the chat. So we just want to give you a couple of minutes to think about what's resonating with you so far. I mean, if anybody wants to unmute themselves and say, you can do that as well, or you can just put it up on the Menti. And I think I'm kind of resonating and thinking about it as well, like Suzanne has. And I think for me, it is that thing. I think one of the most important things for me is how Peg's talked about, right at the very start of the journey, there's got to be that attention to relationships and getting as many people together as possible, but then being really honest about the fact that, we can't include everybody. So then how and why, being really open about why we've not maybe been as successful as we want to be is really important. Go on, Pegs, you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I was just going to share. I was actually on a meeting with Clack Manager Local Authority. They were holding a webinar on I'm having an HLS week on Wednesday, and they talked about very purposefully selecting who goes onto that core oversight group and not being ashamed about that actually in the oversight group, it's okay to be selective, but make sure you've got a good range of selective perspectives that you've deliberately chosen, who are going to be challenging, who are going to engage, who are going to want to kind of work in the values-based way that you think is important, because there will be wider engagement, and you need that core group to really kind of get it and be able to kind of be challenging and challenged. So that was really interesting for me, that it's okay to be quite selective at that point, because there's going to be, generally, if it's a big project, there's going to be a much wider piece of engagement to get a much bigger diversity of views. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. And somebody's put about, not being too jargony. Absolutely. And I think one of the key things about human learning system, which connects, which we're going to look at in a bit, is that thing around power, and language is really powerful. So making sure and being really purposeful about it not being jargony is really important. Staying curious. Absolutely. And this links really nicely to the learning part, and that if you are curious and wanting to learn, that will move it forward, particularly when we're working with such complexity, because no matter what co-produced work you're doing, there will not be one simple answer to finding a solution and sorting out the issue. And being, the other point there is being transparent about reflections, what's worked and what's not. And again, I think if you frame that in the language of learning, then it's much easier for people. Whereas if it looks like a failure or a target that's not been met, then people can get very defensive and feel like they've got to, maybe talk about why that's not happened, and feel quite defensive of it. Because often, if money and funding's linked to outcomes and targets, and if people are always really worried that the funding might get pulled or they won't get more funding. So I think talking about the learning that you've taken is a good way of reframing that and thinking about it in a different way. Yep, the importance of communicating, absolutely. So, and thinking about when communication doesn't go well. So again, that humanness of the human learning system gets us to think about communication when we're building and using the relationships as being human beings. So, all right. Thank you very much for those reflections so far. All right, I'm going to pass over to Gabriel. He's going to give you a little bit more information about human learning systems now.
Yes, and I want to start with another example, because I think what PEX has shown is that you can be very strategic about how to use human learning systems in co-production. And at the same time, you can also sometimes use it just in that one individual conversation that you might have with a person. So this example from Gateshead kind of really speaks to that, because they were supporting a homeless person who had accumulated over 300 offenses over 30 years. And actually, it took just one caseworker who was prepared and eager to sit down with him and understand his life and his priorities. And everybody before that had assumed that, oh, actually, if he's homeless, we need to just find him accommodation, and then that's going to be the extent of it. But actually, that man's priorities wasn't to have a roof above his head. His priority was to get dental treatment, first of all, because he'd been living on the street for so long that his teeth were really hurting him. The second priority, once they'd gone to the dentist and helped him feel better about his teeth, address this. The second priority was to get a better sleeping bag. He didn't want to give up living on the street. He just wanted to have a better, warmer sleeping bag. So they decided, okay, we're going to just look around the local charity shops. We'll find something. It cost next to nothing. The third priority for him was to have a bicycle, because he'd like to move around a little bit more quickly. So again, they managed to get one secondhand, and that was sorted. And once his priorities were met, he came to that point where he said, like, yeah, actually, now I'd really like to have some accommodation as well. And so it was as a result of listening to him and really kind of co-creating that journey with him, starting from where he was at and what was important to him, that he stopped offending and he started to seek help for his addiction. And importantly, he started to have hope for a more positive future. And it was about these small steps at a time, not trying to do everything at once, but actually looking at what's important, where are we in that journey, and how can we travel together with him. And I think that example shows very much that it's fundamental that we recognize the human being, and that we see people as more than just the sum of their needs, that we believe in them, that we want to understand what's going on for them, what's important, what matters. And I think it also shows very much that life is quite messy and life is quite complex. And yet we regularly pretend that life is simple, that the world is simple, and that, you know, if somebody's homeless, then we'll just get them some accommodation, right? Because that's a simple thing that we can do. But actually, when we recognize that we work with complexity, and this kind of framework, the Cynefin framework, can help us kind of understand that, then we need to take a very different approach, because it means that we don't have the solution. Yeah. It means that we need to explore what might be solutions together with the people involved that can help us better understand what the complexity is and how we can go about journeying together, trying to find strategies that might get us into the right direction, okay, rather than finding a solution. And I think it shows that we repeatedly fall into that trap, I think, more broadly in society, that, you know, for instance, with obesity, we think like, oh, that's simple. We just get people onto a healthy diet, get them to exercise. When actually, this is the Foresight Institute that put together the system map of obesity. And you can see how many factors interact to create the outcome of obesity, or the lack of obesity. Okay, it's mind-boggling. If you kind of break it down, there's all these different factors that, as an individual, I have very little control over most of them. Okay, I have some control over some of them, but there's loads around food production, biology, societal influences, food consumption. I can maybe, you know, do something about, but a lot of it is within without my sphere of influence, really. So it's important that we kind of recognize that. And I think one example that speaks to that is from Plymouth, where they've done human learning systems for a very long time. And they use a lot of appreciative inquiry, which Pex has mentioned, to kind of say, you know, we want to address morbid obesity amongst children in Plymouth. And actually, instead of just sending in a dietitian that will say, like, well, actually, you should get a slow cooker and you should put more greens and vegetables and fruit on the table. That's not going to work, because if we don't recognize that people suffer from different types of disadvantages, they're based in a rural location where there's a bus at very irregular times. They don't have the money to pay for the bus to go to a bigger supermarket. They are reliant on the local spar where you can get tinned beans, and that's kind of the extent to which you can get vegetables. And they suffer from mental health issues. The parents suffer from unemployment, and so on and so forth. If we don't understand their life world as a system, then it's no use to say like, oh, look, here's a diet plan for your kid and you'll be fine, because we've tried that so many times and it doesn't work. So we need to really find methods that enable us to really understand the life world of these people and explore together with them what might be a meaningful way to journey in a direction that feels more positive. And so human learning systems has kind of very much grown out of these and many other examples of people in public service, so whether that's in local authorities or in voluntary organizations or in community groups, kind of deciding we need to do things radically different. We need to really center around the human being and look at what can we do in a more meaningful way. How can we recognize that complexity always plays a big role? So human learning systems is a different approach to public management. Public management being how we organize, fund, and govern public service. And human learning systems seeks to respond to the strengths and the needs of the people it serves. So it's not just focused on like, well, actually, these are the needs and we'll address these, but actually also what can we do to draw on the strengths of individuals and groups of people and communities. And so it's rooted very much in the practical realities of people's daily lives, people's real lives, with all the complexity and messiness that is part of everybody's life. And so I want to just kind of briefly introduce each part of human learning systems to give you a bit more of a flavor of it. So it's very much, the image kind of speaks to this idea of gardening. We create the conditions in which people can draw on their inherent potential, and in which we can help people thrive. We support them through those conditions to thrive, to enjoy their sense of agency. And so we need to put ethics at the heart of it. It's primarily an ethical perspective as well, in terms of what are our values? How do we connect to people in a way that is more meaningful, that isn't just instrumentalizing them or sort of depersonalizing them by just seeing them as numbers or statistics in an Excel spreadsheet. And so we need to take collective responsibility to humanize what we do and focus on relationships, to put relationships at the center of our practice. And so the questions that we can therefore ask ourselves is, what does being human look like in our own practice? Where might there be areas where we feel like actually we're treating people as numbers rather than as real human beings? So we're just looking at sort of their needs, but not really the fully rounded human being. And what could we do to kind of have a more humanizing approach in our practice? Those are some of the questions that are important to ask ourselves in that context. Now, the learning is very much about recognizing that when we work in complex situations, learning isn't about transmitting knowledge from one person to another. Learning plays a role in how we share our perspectives, how we share our knowledge. And that fits very nicely with co-production and this idea that we all have different types of expertise, whether that's lived experience or sort of more strategic experience. When we bring that together, we can co-create these insights and learn with each other. And that's really critical. So learning cannot just be a luxury. It's not something that we just do, at the annual performance review or at the bi-weekly team meeting or something. We need to learn all the time. We need to approach everything with, what could I be learning in this situation? Or what have I learned from this conversation? And so on and so forth. So we need to create a learning environment where that's part of it. So the focus needs to be on emergent learning through intentional iterative experimentation, that kind of approach to test and learn. We try something out, we see how it goes, and then we kind of learn from that and decide, like, actually, this is a direction that makes sense, or actually, we need to change something because this doesn't seem to be working. And so the aim is not really to replicate what we've done somewhere else, what we've taken from somewhere else, but actually to increase our own creative possibilities together. So that's where this idea of bringing people together to look at what could we be doing and deciding together, like, okay, actually, this seems like a good direction to travel in, is really important. And it gives us lots of different possibilities to then kind of, figure out what's the best thing to do in this situation. So it requires psychological safety and a positive error culture, because we will get things wrong, we will make mistakes, but actually they're learning opportunities. They tell us something that we didn't know before, that gives us clues about where we might be going wrong, or what kind of insights we haven't considered, whose perspective we might have left out in co-production. And so we need to ask ourselves very much, like, where are we taking a learning mindset in our practice? Where might be the spaces where at the moment there's not that much learning happening? And what could we do to kind of really infuse learning, embed it into everything we do? The next bit then is to look at systems. And within HLS, we have a different understanding of systems, because very often people talk about the system as being kind of external to them, as something that's up there, kind of making our job a bit difficult. But actually, it is about understanding that there's a whole range of different systems that operate at different levels. So you can take a systemic perspective on a person's life and think about, like, who impacts on that person's life, who's important in terms of the relationships that they have within their life, and how can we kind of understand their life as a system in order to kind of work systemically. You could look at the organization that you're part of as a system. You know, that might be the team that you're part of, or the service you're part of, that has different elements to it. And it's kind of like an ecosystem in that it's life, and different parts of it influence each other. You can also look at your place, your locality, as a system, and think about all the different professional agencies that there are, different community groups and community organizations, and so on and so forth, that are part of your local place. And finally, you can look at your region or your country as a system as well. And so no matter at what level you look at it, the thing that creates good outcomes are healthy systems. So the healthier the system, the better the outcomes. And so the important bit there is that healthy systems are about the quality of relationships between the different actors that are involved in that. Okay, so if you want a healthy local system, then a key factor for that is really what is the relationships between, say, the local authority and third sector organizations, between the individuals within the community and those different organizations. If that's really healthy, if there's lots of trust between them, then you have a healthy local system that you can work with. And so within HLS, this idea of system stewardship is really important, to take some responsibility and some stewarding for the system that we are part of is critical if we want to make a real difference, and to build trust, to form relationships, to connect with others that are part of it. Because ultimately, the system looks something like this, okay? It has lots of different actors there in somebody's life, and is impacted by different factors. And if we just think that, oh, we can make all the difference in somebody's life, then we're kidding ourselves and we're failing the person that we're supporting. We need to work with as many of those actors and factors as we possibly can to try and make a positive difference. And so we need to think about, where are we working well with other actors who are important in a person's relational universe, and where might we need to do a little bit more work on that to form new relationships. Okay. Now, very briefly, this idea of the learning cycle, I'd kind of indicated that already, and I think Pex mentioned some of it in her presentation as well. So within human learning systems, we can use this learning cycle to help us start with the purpose here of like, what is the purpose? And bring people together to understand the system. So that's where the co-production journey really needs to start, making sure that we have everybody around the table, that we have the time to really understand people's perspectives, understand people's values, build relationships, build trust, establish that shared sense of purpose that then enables us to go into a co-design phase where we think about what might be the most meaningful thing that we can do and how might we think collectively we can do that. And to then run some learning, test and learn kind of cycles that enable us to kind of put that into practice, see how that goes, learn from that, try to build on it, and so on and so forth, until we feel like, yeah, actually, we're kind of getting somewhere. And then we need to think about, okay, so how can we actually embed that more widely? How can we influence collectively what might need to happen next? And that brings us back to the top of that learning cycle. And basically our role then is that system stewardship bit about kind of supporting that learning journey with the people that are part of it. And to try and connect that across the different systems levels that I mentioned, so that we're learning from the lived experience of people. That learning informs how we're then learning as a team. That learning then informs how we're learning across our local place, and that learning can then inform how we're learning within the region or at a national level. Now, to end with, I think this is a really exciting time, particularly in Scotland, because there is so much interest in human learning systems. And this Monday, there's a big launch of that second phase of, or the latest phase of HLS research, where examples like PEGS mentioned, No One Left Behind. There's examples of Healthcare Improvement Scotland and various other Scottish and international organizations that have been really actively working on HLS. So we'll share some details about that as well, and there'll be lots more events happening, lots of examples of practice of what's going on. And I think particularly in Scotland, there'll be lots more opportunities to kind of really immerse yourselves in HLS and kind of connect, so that hopefully you can use that term in ways that feel meaningful and make other people go like, oh yeah, I've heard about this somewhere else, and that you don't have to quite kind of keep it to yourself if there is that kind of groundswell of interest already.